James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Chair. So I just wanted to respond to a few points of the Minister's just then. She said that only a few countries have an emissions trading scheme. This is correct. However, one of them is China, which is, as we all know, a pretty big market and should be able to sustain any kind of interaction with them that we want. And there are a number of countries, there are more countries that have got carbon taxes in place than have emissions trading schemes in place. Of course, one of the things that we've argued for some time is that a straightforward carbon tax where you recycle all of the revenue in the form of tax cuts to people and to businesses would actually be a far more transparent and predictable model. And it doesn't necessarily exclude countries working cross-border with each other to try and work out ways to reduce their emissions. So there is a growing number of countries that either have carbon taxes or emissions trading schemes in place. This is moving at extreme speed, and the measure, if we wanted to introduce this and say, well, why do we have to take 3 years to do this? Because in 3 years' time, the world would be a much, much more different place than it is now in reference to these kinds of mechanisms. I mean, it's a very different place now to how it was 3 years ago. 3 years ago, China did not have an emissions trading scheme or any carbon taxes in place, and it does now. I just also wanted to mention, in reference to the question about a floor price, yes, the advice is that it is unlikely to drop below where it is now. If that's the case, why not put a floor price in place and be sure, and just to absolutely secure it, just to remove that likelihood completely. You would only not put one in place if you felt that actually there was a risk or was a chance it would drop below the current price. Of course, at the current price, I think it's trading at about $14. It's not actually yet enough for farmers and foresters and other businesses to be making investment decisions about putting their money into lower carbon and therefore cheaper forms of industry. And so the price has to rise if it's going to have any real effect. And I cannot remember the study, but there was one in the last 6 months that said that the price would need to be about $50 a tonne before people started really making major choices about where they directed their investment in the economy. And I just want to note again that France last week put in place a New Zealand $50 a tonne price for 2017, which is on, just next year. So they are moving very, very quickly. So it's disappointing that we're not. I do accept the difficulty of trade-exposed industries, and of course New Zealand Steel is a really obvious one. It's a major employer in South Auckland. It's got 1,000 people working there, and about I think an extended community running into several thousands of people. And it's in very difficult times, with or without a price on carbon. But one of the options that the Minister could explore is to remove the subsidy and bring trade-exposed industries into the emissions trading scheme, and then to put a border adjustment in place so that imported steel was subject to the same carbon price as domestically produced steel, and that would mean that they could compete on an even basis, and it would mean that the consumer of that steel actually has to carry that price, and the consumer is therefore making decisions about can they get more efficient with their use of steel, or could they be looking at other lower carbon goods, for example, laminated wood beams that are, as good as steel in some circumstances. And so we would argue that there are ways of managing those kinds of considerations that would actually move us in the direction of a lower carbon economy, whereas continuing to leave those sectors out of the emissions trading scheme and continuing that subsidy actually continues to fuel growth in emissions, and it doesn't move those industries towards actually doing anything to reduce their emissions.
Julian Genter.